Hello everyone. Welcome to Story Hub channel. Discover real stories of wife betrayals, shocking twists and turns and their secrets. Hit the subscribe button and get to our story. Just a few days ago, everything seemed to be rolling along as usual, juggling work deadlines and family responsibilities like always. My wife Sarah and I had our share of ups and downs, but nothing that felt like it couldn't be handled. We'd built a life filled with joy and countless shared memories. Yet, there was this nagging feeling deep down that I just couldn't shake, but I brushed it off as the usual stress from everyday life. Still, the tension between Sarah and me kept building, and what used to be small disagreements started to snowball into bigger issues. She grew more distant, acting erratic, and every time I tried to address it, she pushed me away. I knew something was off, but I never could have guessed how bad things would get. Now, here I was, sitting on the bedroom floor, feeling completely drained and overwhelmed. It was hard to wrap my head around how I ended up in this situation, when just a few days ago this would have been unimaginable. The carpet beneath me, once something I took pride in, was now ruined. A stark reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Closing my eyes, I muttered to myself, "What am I doing? I'm better than this." When I opened my eyes, they landed on the hardwood bed, and for a split second, I could picture Sarah standing there. But I knew that vision was nothing but a ghost of what used to be. Everything around me was spiraling out of control. My hands were trembling as I tried to steady myself, the weight of the situation crushing down on me. The world around me blurred, but I could still make out a half-empty bottle of whiskey and an empty pill bottle on the bed. I didn't even cap the bottle, I thought bitterly, the strong smell of alcohol filling the room. Panic set in as I looked for the letters I had written. They were still on the bedside table, not on the mattress, thankfully spared from being ruined. What if the wrong person finds them? I worried for a moment, but then quickly pushed the thought aside. I wouldn't be around to care anyway. Why did it have to come to this? I asked myself, feeling the bile rise in my throat. My daughter would hate me for this, but honestly, she probably already did after what went down last week. I can't bear this pain anymore, I whispered to myself. Even as my life slowly ebbed away, the pain clung to me. A week ago, I would have fought with everything I had to survive, but now I was left feeling shattered, unwanted, and despised. There didn't seem to be any other way out. The sharp pain in my wrists dulled, leaving me in a hazy daze as I drifted into a deep sleep. I thought there might be something, maybe a flash of my life, a light, or even just darkness. But there was nothing, just the cold, hard truth that I wanted to live. But it was too late now. As the darkness swallowed me whole, I felt the last bit of strength slip away. Just a week ago, I was laughing with my daughter Emily, spinning her around our home in Dallas, Texas. She was 19, and her boyfriend Jason had just proposed. "Dad, he asked me to marry him," she had said, her eyes sparkling with joy. I knew it was coming and had given him my blessing. Emily and Jason had been inseparable since middle school, and I couldn't have been happier for her. Emily had eagerly shared the proposal story with Sarah and me. Jason sent me on this amazing treasure hunt all around town and finally popped the question under a big oak tree at White Rock Lake, she recounted, her excitement contagious. I hugged her tight and spun her around, just as thrilled as she was. The next morning in the kitchen, I tried to reassure her. Even though you're young, your love is strong. I took a moment to admire the engagement ring on her hand, smiling. "It's beautiful, Em," I said, then turned to Jason. "You did a fantastic job picking it out." Sarah, who was sitting nearby, let out a snort. Even at 42, she was still striking. Brown hair, brown eyes, with a sun-kissed complexion. She raised her wine glass and said, "You should be thanking me." I helped Jason choose it. "Mom, that's not fair," Emily said, turning toward her with a frown. "It's all right, honey," Sarah replied. "I know you made the final decision." Her comment left me feeling uneasy. Sarah had been acting differently over the last few months. Little things she'd say or do just didn't match the loving woman I thought I knew. We went on to celebrate Emily and Jason's engagement with a lively dinner. But even after dessert, when Emily and Jason headed back to their apartment, I couldn't shake the discomfort from Sarah's remark. The next morning, Sarah and I woke up slowly, taking our time. Things started to get a bit physical, but out of nowhere, she pulled away and headed to the bathroom, leaving me in a state of shock. "Sarah," I called after her. "What's going on?" From the bathroom, she answered, "Is there anything in this for me?" A moment later, she added, "I'm already cleaning up." I stood there, stunned. I took a shower, and when I got to the kitchen, I found a note saying she was heading out for the day. Anger surged through me. In all our years together, Sarah had never been so blatantly disrespectful. The thought crept in. Is she seeing someone else? I was lost in thought when my buddy, Roger, gave me a call. "Hey Sam, how's it going?" he asked, his voice as cheerful as ever. "Not much," I replied, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Something's up, isn't it?" Roger pressed, picking up on my mood. I spent the next 10 minutes filling him in on Sarah's odd behavior. Roger just laughed. "If she's messing around, there's not much you can do. Divorce is a 50-50 split, and she's not working. She'll clean you out." "That's not exactly helpful," I said, irritation creeping into my voice. "I'm just being practical," Roger shot back. "Let's talk tomorrow at the office. We've got that report due on the Pembroke project. We can chat about this afterward." "Sure," I agreed, though my enthusiasm was pretty low. Roger and I worked side by side. I was the senior engineer, and he handled the program management. We made a solid team, balancing each other's strengths. Somehow, I managed to get through Sunday. Sarah didn't come home until almost midnight, and she didn't say a word, even though she knew I was still awake. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. "That's not going to work, Sarah," I said as I got out of bed. "Are you really saying no?" she asked, clearly surprised. I started getting dressed for work. "After the way you disrespected me last weekend, I can't. If you're cheating on me—" I didn't even know how to finish the sentence. She sneered. "And what are you going to do about it, Samuel?" "There's nothing you can do." Her tone softened a bit, but there was still that hint of mockery. "Come on, just get back in bed. We both need this." I shook my head. "Who are you? You can't treat me like this, Sarah. The contempt you're showing is unreal." "Well, screw you," she snapped back, her voice dripping with venom. I walked out of the room, feeling disgusted with my wife for the first time in our 21 years of marriage. When I got to the office that morning, I was clearly on edge. My assistant, Myra, picked up on it right away. "Sam, are you okay? You seem really off," she asked, concern in her voice. Myra had been my assistant for a decade. When she first came on board, she had just gotten out of an abusive relationship and showed up to her interview with a black eye. Despite that, she was more than qualified, smart, capable, and way more than just a pretty face. Over the years, she'd earned my respect for her strong sense of right and wrong, and her ability to handle whatever came her way. I hesitated but eventually opened up to Myra about what was happening with Sarah. As I talked, I could see her frown deepen, and by the time I finished, she looked genuinely angry on my behalf. "I don't know what to do, Myra. If she's been cheating on me, I didn't see it coming," I confessed, feeling completely defeated. Myra, who rarely made physical contact, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "First things first, let's get through this Pembroke meeting. We've got some issues with the pipes and concrete," she said, gently shifting the focus back to work. "What? Why didn't Roger mention this?" I asked, already trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Before we could dig any deeper, Roger walked into my office. "You ready to go, buddy?" he asked with a grin. "Roger, what's this about issues with the pipes and concrete?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He just waved it off. "Don't worry, we'll get it sorted." But the meeting turned out to be a complete disaster. The Pembroke owners, who were usually pretty easygoing, were clearly upset. As I delivered my progress report, their expressions grew more and more severe. Peter, the CEO, finally spoke up. "What's going on with the concrete and pipe overruns in the Northeast?" I looked over at Roger, but all he did was shrug. With everyone's eyes on me, I said, "I'll need to check on that. Last week's figures showed everything was still within budget." Peter's frown deepened. Then why have I signed off on over $200,000 in extra costs for concrete and pipes over the past 3 months? I was floored. I looked to Roger again, but his face was impossible to read. He suggested we step outside to sort things out. We ended up in another room, meeting with our boss, Clarence. Before I could even begin to explain, Roger handed Clarence a folder. They brought up the missing materials just like we expected, Roger said. Clarence turned to me, his eyes blazing with anger. What exactly are you trying to say, Sam? He nearly hissed. I was taken aback by his tone. Sir, I've been told everything was on track. I didn't authorize any additional costs. Clarence flipped open the folder and glared at me. So this is the story you're sticking to? He snapped. I was completely bewildered. Roger, now all business, said, we've got requisitions for $26,000. The payments were funneled into a bank account in your name. After all these years, this is how you repay me? Clarence was practically shouting, and I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. The meeting ended with Clarence and Roger taking turns accusing me of fraud, refusing to believe I was innocent. They called in HR, and I was fired on the spot, with Clarence even threatening to get the police involved. To make things worse, Myra was fired as well, simply because she had worked so closely with me. As I was escorted out with a few of my belongings, I caught Roger smirking, clearly thinking I wouldn't notice. Outside, I found Myra by her car, in tears and clearly in shock. Myra, are you okay? I asked, but she spun around, furious. You bastard, Samuel! You committed $200,000 worth of fraud and destroyed my job. I trusted you, she shouted. It wasn't me, Myra, I tried to explain. She cut me off. I saw the signed documents with your signature. How could you do this? And all that stuff about Sarah cheating, was that just another lie? You've ruined my career. For the first time in all the years we'd worked together, I saw nothing but pure rage from Myra. She slapped me hard across the face, calling me a liar and a thief before speeding off. Stunned, I drove home, only to find Sarah waiting for me. She sneered, the cheating husband finally comes home. How pathetic. In the days that followed, I noticed that Sarah seemed almost pleased with how everything was falling apart. Confused, I confronted her. What's going on, Sarah? I didn't do any of this. Sarah just grinned. It doesn't matter, Sam. I'm done with you. A little while later, there was a knock at the door. A man handed me a thick envelope. You've been served, he said before turning to leave. Inside were divorce papers. Sarah, a divorce? I whispered, feeling like my world was crumbling even more. Sarah laughed. Of course. I've been seeing someone else for months. He's everything you're not. Interesting and well off. You've lost your job, your family, and soon, your freedom. She leaned in, savoring my misery. Make it easy on yourself. Sign the papers. I'm taking the house and most of the property. You'll be in jail soon anyway. So, you're staying with your lover then? I asked, feeling a deep sense of betrayal. She laughed again, a cruel sound. Yes, and once you're locked up, we'll be renting out the place. And don't even think about stalking me, or I'll have you thrown in jail. I sat down, utterly overwhelmed by everything that was happening. Sarah noticed the handprint Myra had left on my face and smiled with a twisted satisfaction. At least that tramp got fired too. Go rot in a hole, Samuel, she spat, and then she walked out. I spent the rest of that day doing absolutely nothing, not even turning to a drink. The next day, still at a loss for what to do, I tried calling Emily, but it went straight to voicemail. After about 20 rings, she finally picked up. What do you want? She asked, her tone icy. Emily, I began, but she cut me off. Just stop, Dad, she snapped. Mom told me everything. About your cheating, your lies, and the affair with your assistant. You've destroyed so many lives, and I've never been more disappointed in anyone. I was speechless, and just as I tried to respond, she interrupted me again. Listen, John and I want nothing to do with you. You were on the news. The police are after you. Don't come to our wedding. I don't want someone like you walking me down the aisle. I'll find someone else. I couldn't say a word as tears rolled down my face. Are you even listening? Do you realize how badly you've messed everything up? Emily demanded. But all I could do was sob. Goodbye, Dad. You're dead to me. Don't ever try to contact me again, she said. And then the line went dead. I collapsed, crying uncontrollably. 2 days later, the police showed up and arrested me, bombarding me with questions about the alleged fraud. They eventually released me but told me not to leave town since I had a court date the following week. Back home, I looked around at the family photos and Emily's trophies. All the memories now felt so hollow. The past week had been a complete blur. Deep down, I knew I was missing something, but I couldn't figure out what. My wife left me, my daughter disowned me, I lost my job, and Myra blamed me. Even my friends had turned their backs, telling me to stay away. I was utterly alone, defeated, with no idea what to do next. As an engineer, I was used to solving problems, but this felt beyond impossible. After a shower, I forced down a stale sandwich, though the taste only deepened my despair. Emily cutting me out of her life was the hardest blow. I stared at the table, where a bottle of sleeping pills and some whiskey sat. For the first time, dark thoughts crossed my mind, but I shook them off. I just needed some time. The next morning, I received a restraining order that barred me from contacting Sarah, John, or Roger, and demanded I vacate the house by Monday. It struck me as odd that Roger was included. Something clicked in my mind. In a fit of rage, I texted him, "You bastard! This is all your fault. I'm going to find you and make you pay." I didn't get a reply, but not long after, the detectives returned, reprimanding me for violating the restraining order. They didn't care about my side of the story. They just wanted me back in jail. They told me to stay in the house and pack up my things, with a detective watching over me. Frustrated, I downed 3 shots of whiskey and decided to write notes to Sarah, Emily, and Myra. To Sarah, I wrote, "I'm deeply disappointed in you. You're a treacherous woman, and I hope you burn in hell for what you've done to me." I filled the note with every curse I could think of, then spat on it before sealing it in an envelope. To Emily, I expressed my deep sadness and heartbreak that she never even asked if I was guilty. "I never cheated on your mother. She's the one who cheated on me. I never stole any money," I wrote. I begged her to see through the lies and to grow up. Then I softened my tone, urging her to love John with all her heart and to think kindly of me once the dust settled. I also asked her not to let Roger walk her down the aisle, as he had betrayed me. Tears stained the letter as I sealed it in an envelope. To Myra, I began with an apology. "You're not at fault for any of this," I wrote. I explained how I believed Roger had betrayed both of us, and that he was probably the one involved with Sarah. I also apologized if I had ever made her uncomfortable with any glances, assuring her they were nothing more than a shy appreciation of her beauty. I asked for her forgiveness once her anger had settled. After sealing the letters, I placed them on the bedside table, adding a post-it note instructing the detectives to investigate Roger's finances if they were truly after the truth. "Next time, do your job properly and don't push an innocent man to this," I scrawled. I then took a bottle of whiskey and the sleeping pills into the bedroom. After setting the letters on the bedside table, I attached the note about Roger. I took a long, hot shower, sipping more whiskey before downing the pills. I dressed myself neatly and then collapsed on the floor near the bathroom, holding a straight razor as I wrestled with the thought of ending it all. I felt like I had become unwanted and despised. Later, I found out that Detective David R. Light had been the one who saved me. He had been keeping an eye on the situation, and after a concerned neighbor alerted him, he entered the house and found me in desperate need of help. An ambulance was called, and my home became a crime scene. When they found me, I was in critical condition, barely conscious, and they quickly rushed me to safety. The investigation uncovered 3 hidden cameras that I knew nothing about, along with the whiskey, pill bottle, and letters. I was unconscious for 3 days. When I finally woke up, a nurse quietly informed me that I was in a private hospital in Hollywood. She pointed out Myra, who had been sitting by my side despite everything that had happened. When I saw her, I quietly said her name, which woke her up immediately. She reached out and took my hand. Sam, what were you thinking? She demanded, her voice gentle despite the frustration, her eyes filled with tears. I thought it would be better this way, I admitted, feeling overwhelmed with shame. She snorted. You think ending your life is the answer? I've known you for over a decade, and I've never seen you give up this easily. What were you thinking? Myra kept asking, her voice steady as we sat there in silence, the only sound being the hum of the machines around us. Finally, I spoke. Myra, I'm so sorry. When Sarah, you, and Emily turned on me, I felt completely trapped. No one even asked if I was guilty. I was just condemned. My wife told me to die. My daughter disowned me. My friend betrayed me, and I hurt you. I wasn't thinking clearly. I got drunk and, in a weak moment, did what seemed like the only option at the time. I didn't think I deserved to be here, I said sadly. She nodded, and then gently sat on the edge of the bed. I'm sorry too, Sam, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I was so angry and didn't consider that you might be innocent. I was wrong. It's okay, Myra, I replied softly. No, it's not. The fact that you're here, thinking I'm part of what drove you to this. I don't know if I can forgive myself, she said, starting to cry. It's okay, Myra, I repeated, closing my eyes, feeling utterly exhausted. We sat in silence, her hand still holding mine, until a doctor came in, smiling as he looked over my chart. Well, Mr. Harris? It's good to see you awake. How are you feeling? He asked. Alive. Didn't expect to be, I replied. The doctor frowned slightly, as did Myra. Let's work on keeping you that way, he said, brushing off my comment. He checked my stitches and vitals while Myra watched, gasping when she saw the extent of my wounds. The doctor explained that I needed to take it easy, due to the blood loss and the effects of the stomach pumping. He also mentioned that a detective wanted to speak with me. When we were alone again, I asked Myra, Are you here because of the letter I left? She shook her head. No, I haven't seen it. Detective Light mentioned it, she said, her voice trembling. My cousin works here and called me as soon as you were admitted after you tried to take your life. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, overwhelmed with shame. Myra continued. I was still furious when I left, but deep down, I knew you couldn't have done it. I've worked with you for so many years. When I heard what happened, I realized you must have been set up. I'm so sorry, Sam, she sobbed, her head resting against my chest, her tears soaking through the hospital gown. After a few minutes, she stood up and wiped her face. When she tried to pull her hand away from mine, I held on, not ready to let go. She gently wiped the tears from my eyes and gave me a small smile. I thought about it more and realized it didn't add up. You always loved your job. But when Roger showed me those documents, I was just so angry, she said, noticing how I tensed at the mention of Roger's name. It was him, wasn't it? Roger set you up. I nodded. I believe so. I can't prove it yet, but the signs are all there. He didn't warn us about the overspending, and there are signed documents I've never seen before. I also think he's involved with Sarah. I paused, closing my eyes while still holding Myra's hand. I'm sorry, Myra. I never thought Roger and Sarah would drag you into this mess. But I couldn't see a way to prove my innocence, and that's why I did what I did. We fell into a heavy silence until a new voice broke in. You're right. You can't prove it. Yet. They did a thorough job framing you, but real criminals always slip up somewhere. The man who entered the room was tall, fit, and exuded a quiet confidence. Mr. Harris, I'm Detective David R. Light. Your neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins, and I were the ones who found you. Glad to see you're feeling better. I shrugged. Thanks. But I suppose you'll be arresting me once I'm released, I said bitterly, feeling Myra's hand tighten around mine. About that, Detective Light began. Myra and I both looked at him as he ran a hand through his hair. I've been assigned to your case, and some things just don't add up. Would you be willing to go through an interview again? I think so. I've got nothing left to lose, I replied. Myra suddenly spoke up. What about a lawyer? Shouldn't he have one? The detective sighed. Yes, he absolutely should have a lawyer, and it's a good idea. Myra nodded and turned to me. I'll take care of it. She left the room to make a call, and the detective and I watched her as she walked out. Detective Light commented, "She cares about you a lot, Mr. Harris. I think you're going to need people like her on your side right now." "I'm the one you're investigating," I reminded him. He grinned slightly. "True. But I think there's more to this case than meets the eye. You do believe you're innocent, don't you?" "Absolutely. I'd never steal from a company I loved working for," I said, showing him my bandaged wrists. Just then, Myra returned. "My cousin, Reagan Brown, will be representing Sam," she announced. The detective smiled. "I know Reagan. She's a good lawyer. Have her get in touch with me as soon as possible." We talked for a few more minutes before the detective took his leave. "That was unusual," I remarked. "Yeah, cops aren't usually this friendly," Myra agreed. We sat in silence for a bit until I asked, "Who's looking after Tilly?" "My mom's got her," Myra said, handing me a drawing from Tilly, a little hospital scene with a "get well soon" message. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at it. "Thank you," I said. "Have you heard from Emily at all?" Myra shook her head, her expression sad. "I've tried calling, but she hasn't responded," she said quietly. We continued talking in hushed tones until Reagan arrived. After brief introductions, Myra stepped out to give us some privacy. Reagan, like Myra, had sandy brown hair, and the family resemblance was clear. "She cares about you, you know," Reagan said, echoing what the detective had mentioned earlier. I snorted. "We've worked together for years." Reagan smirked. "Men can be pretty clueless sometimes." I let out a humorless laugh. "My ex-wife is proof of that." Reagan gave me a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry. I've talked to Detective Light and it sounds like he's on your side. I have some theories about what's really going on, and I'll be handling your case. Your only crime was trusting the wrong people." She paused before asking, "What do you want out of the divorce?" My face hardened. "I want as much as I can get." Reagan nodded, understanding my anger. "Sarah and Roger set you up, possibly stole from the firm, and left you to take the fall. You have every right to go after them with everything you've got. Don't hold back." I liked my new lawyer, Reagan. She spent time with me, asking about the events leading up to my attempt on my life, reassuring me that things would eventually be okay. She mentioned that she'd arrange a formal police interview after I was released from the hospital. The next few days passed slowly. I stayed in the hospital, with doctors and nurses checking on me regularly. Without my phone, I had no way to contact anyone, and I doubted anyone wanted to hear from me anyway. But Myra visited the next day, bringing me a paperback book, The Terror by Dan Simmons, which made me laugh. It was a book I had enjoyed years ago. As Myra sat beside me, reading her copy of Pride and Prejudice, she smiled and said, "I'm here to take care of you." We chatted, and when lunchtime came around, she brought me a roast beef sandwich with chips and a chicken wrap for herself. Despite the lingering pain in my wrists, I started to feel a bit more like myself. Later, Myra returned just as the doctors removed my IV and informed me that I'd be discharged the next morning if my blood tests came back clear. "I don't know where to go," I confessed to her. "I don't have a phone or wallet to get a hotel, and I can't go back home." Myra smiled warmly. "Reagan got a court order to access your belongings. I brought your phone, wallet, clothes, laptop, iPad, and even your shaving kit." I was stunned by her kindness. "Thank you. At least now I can find a hotel." But I noticed she looked concerned. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. "You were right about Roger and Sarah," she said softly. "When Reagan, the officer, and I went to get your things, they were there, living together. They weren't expecting anyone to show up." I sighed, feeling a fresh wave of anger and betrayal. "I'm sorry you had to see that. What happened?" She managed a small smile. "They yelled at me to leave until the officer reminded them they'd be arrested for violating a court order. After that, I got your things." Tears welled up in her eyes as she recalled seeing the bloodstain on the carpet. "Please, don't ever do that again," she pleaded. I promise, I said softly, holding up my bandaged hands as reassurance. The next day, after cleaning up and getting dressed, Myra met me as I was discharged, and we walked to her car. She drove me to a condo complex in Kings Park. Myra, why are we here? Am I staying at your place? I asked, a bit surprised. Of course you can stay with me, she replied with a warm smile. You don't need to waste money on a hotel. Stay in my guest room for a few days. Reagan is meeting us this afternoon to go over your case. I'd been to Myra's house before, a cozy 2-story home she shared with her daughter, Tilly. After settling in, Reagan arrived, bringing along a stack of legal documents and a serious expression on her face. Bart, you're a very lucky man, Reagan said, her tone serious yet reassuring. She explained that Roger and Sarah had nearly pulled off their plan, but it had started to fall apart. All of my accounts had been frozen, including the one they'd fraudulently opened in my name. Reagan had managed to obtain video evidence of them opening that account and was pursuing legal action against them for fraud and mental cruelty. She assured me they'd face the consequences soon. Reagan also informed us that she had already initiated legal proceedings against my former employer for unfair dismissal. She expected everything to be resolved by the end of the week and arranged for a formal interview with Detective Light the next day, advising me to follow her instructions carefully. She was confident that Sarah and Roger would be arrested soon. Over the next hour, we went over the details and signed several documents. Reagan reassured me that all charges against me would be dropped the next day. After she left, I unpacked my clothes and toiletries. Myra and I spent the afternoon discussing what might happen next, trying to prepare for the days ahead. When Myra left to pick up Tilly from school, I turned on my phone for the first time in days. I found a slew of missed calls and texts, most of them from Sarah, taunting me to sign the divorce papers before I ended up in jail. Surprisingly, there were also several missed calls from my former job, asking me to get in touch. But there was nothing from Emily. When Myra and Tilly returned, Tilly was full of energy and excitement, eagerly sharing her day with me. I enjoyed spending time with her, helping with her homework, and reading together. She reminded me so much of Myra, and her innocent joy was a welcome relief from the heaviness of my recent days. We had dinner together and watched some TV before it was time for bed. Tilly asked me to tuck her in, and when she gave me a hug goodnight, it almost brought tears to my eyes. Her genuine affection was a stark contrast to the pain of Emily's rejection. Afterward, Myra and I sat on the couch, talking quietly. She held my hand and hugged me, assuring me that everything would be okay. The next day, after the interview with Detective Light and Reagan, all charges against me were officially dropped. That evening, the news reported that Sarah and Roger had warrants out for their arrest for fraud and identity theft, but they were nowhere to be found. Later that night, I received a call from Emily for the first time since everything happened, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. The next day she called and texted repeatedly, asking me to call her back, but I still wasn't ready. Her sudden concern felt insincere, driven more by the fallout from her mother and Roger's actions than genuine care for me. I was angry that she had abandoned me so easily, and only now was reaching out. That night, I had a nightmare about the night I tried to end my life. In the dream, Sarah and Roger were mocking me, and then Myra, Emily, and John joined in, leaving me to die. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Myra rushed to my side, and I saw Tilly standing in the doorway crying. I buried my head in my hands and sobbed. "I'm sorry. I just can't do this," I said, struggling to calm down. Myra and Tilly climbed onto the bed with me. Tilly, trying to comfort me, said, "It's okay, Uncle Bart. You just had a bad dream. Mom and I will stay with you." I couldn't fall back asleep after that. Tilly eventually drifted off beside me, her small hand resting on my stomach, while Myra looked at me with deep concern. "Are you okay, Bart?" she asked softly, holding me close. I thought for a moment. "No, I'm not okay. It was a dream about that night." I couldn't finish the sentence, but Myra understood. She kissed my cheek and nestled into my neck. "What are we going to do, Bart?" she whispered, her voice heavy with pain. I hugged Myra and Tilly close. We'll figure it out. It's going to be okay. In that moment, Myra's concern helped me feel more like myself than I had since that terrible night. I held on to them both until the sun rose, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. The next morning, after breakfast, Myra took Tilly to school while I started searching for a counselor. I knew I needed help. By the time Myra returned, I had already made several calls. She smiled at me, then her expression grew serious. "Bart, can we talk?" she asked, leading me over to the couch. I nodded, thinking I knew where this conversation was headed. "It's okay, Myra," I said. "I realized last night was scary. With Tilly here, it's not good if I'm waking up screaming. I'll find somewhere else to stay." Her eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed my hands, looking almost panicked. "No, Bart, that's not what I wanted to talk about. It's actually the opposite." She took a deep breath. "Bart, I'm in love with you," Myra said, almost stumbling over the words. "Excuse me?" I replied, completely stunned. "I'm in love with you, and have been for a long time," she repeated more softly, a blush creeping up her cheeks. She searched my face as she continued. "When I heard you were in the hospital, I went out of my mind with worry. I couldn't stand the thought of losing you without telling you how I felt." I was speechless as she went on. "I tried to keep it to myself, but seeing you so hurt last night broke my heart. I had to tell you." "Haven't you noticed I don't go on dates?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, still puzzled. "But I assumed it was because of Tilly." "That's part of it," she admitted. "But it's also because no one else measures up to you." She explained how she had admired me from the moment she started working with me. I treated her with respect, helped her, and made Tilly feel special. "You've been like a father figure to her," Myra said. "When everything fell apart last week, you handled it with such grace. You didn't lash out, even when I did." She blushed, recalling how she had slapped me. "You're an incredible man, Bart. I love you for so many reasons. If Sarah was foolish enough to throw you away, I'm here to pick up the pieces." She kissed me, and time seemed to stand still. "Will you take me, Bart? Will you make me your woman?" Myra asked. I was in shock. I had fantasized about her before, but this was all happening so fast. I knew things with Sarah were over, and Myra's love made me feel less like a failure. But I also worried it might backfire. Myra seemed to sense my hesitation but didn't say anything. She simply took my hand and led me to her bedroom. Afterward, we fell asleep. I had another dream like the one before, where Sarah and Roger were tormenting me. But this time, Myra appeared in the dream, healing my wounds and flying away, leaving behind the scene of anxiety and sorrow. We woke to the sound of the alarm. I shuddered, but didn't scream. As we dressed, I told Myra about the dream, and she looked concerned. She took me with her when she went to pick up Tilly from school. A few more weeks passed, and both Roger and Sarah were arrested while trying to flee the country. They panicked when they realized the charges against me had been dropped and drove from Perth to Adelaide, where customs officials caught them. It took 2 months for them to be brought back to Perth. But during that time, my relationship with Myra grew stronger. I moved into her bedroom, now our bedroom, and felt like I was in my 20s again. I had clearly fallen in love with her. When Roger and Sarah were finally brought back to Perth, I realized Myra was right. I hardly thought about Sarah anymore. A month later, Myra, Reagan, and I testified in court against Sarah and Roger. Roger avoided looking at me throughout the trial, and in the end, he was sentenced to 15 years. Sarah, however, kept her eyes on me the entire time. During the trial, it was revealed that Roger had masterminded the entire scheme, seduced Sarah, and orchestrated the fraud. Sarah was sentenced to 20 years as an accessory, with an additional 5 years for mental cruelty based on the evidence from the hidden cameras she had set up for Roger. After the verdict, the judge granted our divorce. Reagan pointed out that we had split our savings and agreed to sell the house, with the proceeds to be divided immediately. I also agreed, after considerable persuasion from Reagan, to act as trustee for Sarah's funds until she served her time. I wasn't allowed to use her funds, but could invest them. The court ordered Roger and Sarah to begin their sentences immediately. Sarah's lawyer requested that I spend an hour with her before she was taken to jail, and after some hesitation, I agreed. In the interrogation room, Sarah looked utterly defeated, her shoulders slumped. Unlike in the courtroom, she didn't meet my gaze. After a few minutes of silence, she quietly said, "I'm sorry, Sam." I was surprised that she spoke first and apologized. "Are you Sarah?" I asked, letting a bit of my bitterness seep through. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Yes, Sam. I'm sorry." I wanted to dismiss her apology, but she asked to continue. I gestured for her to go on. "Thank you," she said, looking me in the eye. "Believe it or not, Sam, I really am sorry. I don't know what happened to me. I loved you. I still do, despite everything I did. But one day, I woke up feeling this inexplicable sense of loss." She looked down at her hands and continued. "A few weeks after that feeling started, everything began to spiral. I got angry at you because you still loved me, even though I didn't feel the same. Roger noticed and started pushing my buttons. It took about a month before the affair began. He played on my insecurities and got me into bed, then used my guilt to set his plan in motion. You might not have known, but Roger was always jealous of you, your leadership, your success. He convinced me to open a bank account in your name and make it look like you stole the money. We both knew you were trusted, and by the time it all unraveled, Roger had planned for us to escape with the money. We thought we'd be out of reach if we were caught. And meanwhile, you didn't care that you were destroying me," I said, struggling to keep my anger in check. She nodded sadly. "At first, I didn't want to. But Roger broke me down piece by piece. To make the plan work, you had to be completely broken." "You nearly succeeded," I replied. "If it weren't for Detective Light and Myra, you might have—" We sat in silence for a while before Sarah asked, "Can I see them?" Understanding, I placed my scarred hands on the table. She gasped and started to reach for them, but hesitated, tears streaming down her face. Inside, I was overwhelmed with emotions: rage, shame, and to my surprise, a lingering shred of love for her. Sarah seemed to sense my turmoil and looked at me with an intensity that was hard to ignore. "I'm really sorry, Sam. I'm ashamed of what I did. I'm going to serve my 20 years without appeal. I deserve it." I nodded, feeling some relief that she would face her sentence. She looked up at me again. "Sam, just so you know, you were never a bad lover. You were far better than Roger. He was selfish in bed, unlike you. I have no excuse for how I treated you that last morning." We sat in silence for a moment, and then she asked, "You and Myra?" "Yeah," I replied, a bit uncertain. She smiled weakly. "Good. Myra's loved you for years, you know." "I just found out recently," I admitted. With a mix of passion and pain in her voice, she said, "I hope she loves you and helps heal the pain I caused. She'll never betray you like I did. She's everything I'm not." "Sarah, I hesitated, not sure what to say. "Don't worry," she said, gently wiping away my tears with her sleeve. "I agreed to your terms. I was surprised by how generous you were, even after everything." I sighed. "Sarah, I once loved you more than you probably realized. If you had just talked to me about how you were feeling, maybe we could have avoided all of this. But I'm trying to move past what you did. I still have a lot of anger inside. I want to scream at you, to strangle you for what you said, but I can't. I chose to end my life, and I have to live with that choice." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Sarah said, "I'm sorry, Sam. You deserved better than what I gave you. I share the guilt for pushing you too far. I'll always be ashamed. I read the letter you wrote, and you were right. I will burn for what I did, but I thank God that you're still alive." I clenched my teeth, struggling with the storm of emotions swirling inside me. How could Sarah say these things now, trying to ease the anger and pain I was still holding on to? It didn't seem fair, so I changed the subject. "I offered to manage your money out of respect for our years together. You'll have enough to start over when you get out, if you want to, I said, trying and failing to keep my emotions in check. Sarah noticed my effort, but went along with the change in topic. Laughing bitterly, she said, I'll be in my 60s by then. Hopefully there'll be enough to retire on. Keep at it, and you'll make it to 80. We talked briefly about our finances, which helped us both relax a bit, but I sensed she had more on her mind. Have you talked to Emily? She asked hesitantly. I shook my head. Emily cut me off, believed your lies, and it broke me. She never even asked if I was innocent. She just threw me away. After that call, I stopped. I turned away, trying to hide the tears. If I had looked back, I would have seen Sarah crying too. Facing away, I continued. Myra tried reaching out to Emily while I was in the hospital, but there was nothing. I wiped my face and sat back down while Sarah did the same. I'm sorry, Sam, Sarah said, wrinkling her nose as if in pain. Roger and I planned this, including turning Emily against you. I nodded, feeling a surge of anger as Sarah admitted her actions. She hung her head in shame, knowing she had shattered my relationship with our daughter. If it's any consolation, Sarah said sadly, Emily has cut me off too. She's angry and scared, and I can't fix it. She feels guilty about how she treated you, and the fact that you're not talking to her makes it worse. Sarah paused, then continued. Sam, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but could you find it in your heart to forgive Emily? She needs at least one parent. I realize now that even if I wasn't in prison, the guilt of what I did would have destroyed me. Please, Sam, take care of our daughter. Sarah, I took a deep breath. What you're asking is hard. You hurt me deeply, but when Emily told me I was dead to her, that hurt more than anything you did. I want to reconnect with her, but the pain of what she and you did, I don't know how to get past it. Sarah nodded, understanding the struggle I was facing. I get it, she said sadly, knowing I was trying but still had a long way to go. I sighed. Look, Sarah, I'm trying not to hate you. I'm getting professional help, but it's hard not to yell and curse at you. As for Emily, I'll think about talking to her, but I can't promise anything. Sarah seemed to age before my eyes during this conversation. She stood up and said, Sam, I know it means little now, but I'm sorry for what I did. I have no excuses, and I know I can never make up for it. I'll serve my time and hope that one day you might find it in your heart to forgive me. She looked up at me, her face lined with the weight of her choices. You may not believe me, but I still love you. I lost sight of that for a while, but I always will. We stood in awkward silence as tears streamed down Sarah's face. She knocked on the door, and her prison escort opened it. Before leaving, she looked back at me one last time. Love Myra, Sam. Give her the love I foolishly threw away. Live a beautiful life and hold your head high. Remember, there are people who care about you. Even in my darkest moments, I lost sight of that. But I'm proud of you. You're becoming yourself again. Goodbye, my beautiful man. I'll never forget you, Sarah said as she walked out. I stood there for a moment, reflecting on our conversation. There had been no shouting, no angry words. Sarah had accepted responsibility, and the prison sentence that came with it. As I left the room, I noticed a trail of tears on the floor where she had walked. I paused, mourning what once was, then turned and walked away. My spirits lifted when I saw Myra waiting for me in the public gallery, looking beautiful even on such a somber day. Did everything go okay? She asked. Yes, I replied. It was surprising. I expected excuses, but she took most of the blame and showed real remorse. What do you make of that? Myra asked. I still have a lot of anger toward Roger and her, but unlike Roger, I also feel some pity for her. She knows she ruined everything, and now she's paying for it. Even Grace has cut her off, I said. Myra nodded, then hesitated for a moment. John and Grace are here. John said they'd be at the cafe across the street if you wanted to talk. Apparently, they had a big fight over how Grace treated you, but she's desperate to see you. I took a deep breath. You think I should talk to her, don't you? Myra nodded. Yes, my love. There's a pain in your soul that only grace can heal. But I'll be with you the whole time. And if I need to, I'll defend you like a mama bear. I love you, Sam. I leaned in and kissed her. I love you too, Myra. It was my first public declaration of love for her, and I didn't care who saw. Myra was the only person who mattered. Let's go, I said, and we walked hand in hand to the cafe. As we entered, we saw Grace and John sitting at a table. Grace looked torn between running away and rushing into my arms. I opened my arms, and she clung to me, crying and repeatedly saying, "I'm sorry, Daddy." I glanced at Myra, who smiled reassuringly, and at John, who looked unsure of what to do. After a few minutes, I gently pushed Grace away, and we all sat down. "I just talked to your mom," I said quietly. Grace nodded. "I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I held up my hand to stop her. "I know, Gracie. Your mom explained a lot, but your words hurt me deeply. I felt abandoned by someone I thought would always be there for me. What hurt the most was that you didn't even ask if I was innocent." Grace blushed with embarrassment. "Dad, She squared her shoulders, trying to compose herself. "No, I need to say this. I should have given you a chance to explain, but I didn't. I can't blame Mom or Roger, but they convinced me you were guilty, that you were going to jail, that you were having an affair." She glanced at Myra. "By the time you called, I was so worked up that I said things I regret." John added, "That's what caused a lot of our arguments. When Myra left messages about you being in the hospital, I thought it was just a trick. Mom and Roger made it sound like you were just seeking attention, and that Myra was part of some scheme." Grace looked at Myra, then back at me. "They said you just wanted attention, but it's true, Dad. You were trying to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, and none of us could. I nodded, took a deep breath, and showed Grace the scars on my wrists. "I'm sorry, Gracie. I was at my lowest point and didn't see a way out. I got drunk and made a terrible mistake," I said slowly. It was hard to speak, but I knew I had to show her the impact of her words. Grace began sobbing into her hands while Myra held me close as our emotions threatened to overwhelm us. After a few moments of silence, John spoke up, trying to lighten the mood. "I know this is serious, but can I assume something good came out of all this?" John asked, gesturing toward Myra and me. Grace looked up, her eyes widening. "Daddy? You and Myra?" "Yes," I nodded, feeling the need to clarify. "But it wasn't an affair like your mother told you. I never cheated. When I woke up in the hospital, Myra refused to leave me. Even she believed what Roger and your mother said for a while. We reconciled, and I realized how much she loved me." Myra blushed, wrapping her arms around me, and gave me a quick kiss. John smiled, and Grace, after a moment, found her composure. "Thank you," she said to Myra. "Thank you for being there for my dad." Myra laughed, easing the tension in the room, and we spent the next few hours talking and sharing our experiences. At one point, Grace switched seats with Myra to give me a hug. While that meeting didn't heal everything, it was a start. It took months for Grace and me to rebuild our relationship. We went to counseling together to work through trust issues and other challenges. One particularly difficult session involved me asking Grace not to cut her mother out of her life completely. Despite everything, Sarah was still her mother, and she was paying the price for her actions. Grace agreed to visit Sarah, but only if I went with her the first time. That meeting was tough, and we didn't talk much about it afterward, but Grace made an effort. A week later, Sarah sent me a letter thanking me for convincing Grace to see her. 6 months later, when things had finally settled down, I proposed to Myra during a family dinner. Tilly and Grace thought it was long overdue, and John shook my hand, telling me to take care of her, echoing the words I'd once said to him. Soon after, Grace and John got married with my blessing. Myra visited Sarah in jail and asked if she could take over as mother of the bride. Sarah, in tears, agreed. Tilly was the flower girl, proudly calling herself my second daughter. From that moment, I was no longer Uncle Sam, but Dad. Walking Grace down the aisle, I felt the last remnants of our strained relationship disappear. And later, Grace sent photos and a letter to Sarah, thanking her for allowing Myra to step in. I hear that Sarah keeps those on the wall in her cell. Meanwhile, as the legal issues with Roger and Sarah settled, Reagan negotiated a significant settlement for Myra and me. Clarence initially resisted, but just before the trial, he offered a deal that Reagan rejected as too low. Eventually, we secured a high six-figure sum for Myra and a seven-figure sum for me. The settlement was small compared to the potential damage of a public trial, but it forced Clarence to retire and sell his company for much less than it was worth. With the settlement money, Myra and I started our own engineering consulting firm, offering administrative and engineering services. Within 6 months, we had 5 employees working on large projects across the country. One of our first clients was Peter Pembroke, who took us to dinner to apologize. He realized we had been wronged and admitted that the project had nearly failed without my engineering skills. Since then, we've been invited to all major Pembroke events, whether we're working on their projects or not. Peter was a good man caught in a bad situation, eager to make amends. We sold Myra's small house and bought a much larger one with a stunning view of Kings Park. The old 5-bedroom, 3-bath house needed restoration, and we spent 2 years fixing it up, taking breaks only for family holidays, a wedding, and the birth of Grace and Tilly's little brother, Byron. Life improved, though I still had occasional bad dreams, with Myra always by my side. More than a decade later, Byron was 10 and Tilly was in university, studying law like Aunt Reagan. One lazy Saturday, Grace and John were with us on our front terrace, overlooking Kings Park. Byron was playing Xbox with my 7-year-old grandson, Bruce, while my 5-year-old granddaughter, Hope, tried to join in. Grace brought up her mother. "How's Mom doing?" Grace asked quietly, glancing at me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years that had passed since everything had happened. "She's doing okay, I think," I replied. "She writes to me sometimes, mostly to ask how you're doing." Grace nodded, a mixture of emotions playing across her face. "I visit her occasionally, but it's still hard. I know she regrets everything, but sometimes it's difficult to reconcile the person she is now with the person she was back then." I nodded in understanding. "It's never easy, Gracie, but you've done what you can, and I'm proud of you for that." Grace smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." As I looked around at my family, the warmth of their presence filled me with a deep sense of peace. Life had taken unexpected turns, and the journey had been anything but smooth. But in that moment, surrounded by those I loved, I knew we had all found our way back to each other. "Dad, I got a letter from Mom this week," Grace said cautiously. Although Sarah wasn't a forbidden topic, everyone was careful when mentioning her. Over the years, I had received several letters from Sarah and even visited her a few times. I knew she was undergoing treatment and had earned respect in prison, though she still had 8 years left on her sentence. "What did she say?" I asked, curious but cautious. "Among other things, she mentioned that Roger was released last month," Grace said. I silently sipped my drink, feeling Myra's comforting hand on mine. "Did she say anything else?" Myra asked gently. Grace nodded. "Yeah, she said he came to see her. He didn't look well, and it wasn't a calm conversation. I'm planning to visit her next week to learn more." We discussed it briefly, but the unease lingered, so I decided to call David R. Light, now a close friend and head of the major crimes team. "Bart, how are you? How's Myra?" David greeted me warmly. "Myra's doing great," I replied. "But I just found out that Roger was released." David's tone immediately grew serious. "Yes, I got the report yesterday. I plan to tell you at bowling next week. He's moving to Adelaide, got a job, and told his probation officer he wished you'd rot in hell for ruining his life. He's had a rough time, though, and I don't think he'll be a problem." "Thanks, David. That was my concern. If I hear anything, I'll let you know." We chatted briefly about bowling and an upcoming barbecue before I returned to the table. Myra looked at me with concern. "David?" I nodded. He confirmed Roger has left and is moving to Adelaide, but he still hates me. The feeling's mutual, I said, sharing the news with the family. The rest of the day was a bit subdued, but my family made sure I felt supported and loved. That night, I woke up screaming from my first nightmare in years. In the dream, Roger threatened my family, forcing me to use the razor again. Myra woke up instantly, trying to calm me down. Without hesitation, she called my therapist, who kindly took our call at 2 a.m. I explained the dream, while Myra cried beside me. Talking about it helped, and my therapist suggested the dream was triggered by Roger's release and my lingering anxiety. We arranged a follow-up session. Afterward, Myra checked on Byron, who was still sound asleep. Tilly had woken up but went back to bed after hearing our conversation. I lay back down, and Myra snuggled close, holding me tightly. "Do you think Roger will be a problem?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "No. I think he'll disappear, and we won't hear from him again. And even if we do, we're prepared," I said, hinting at the hunting gear we had stored safely. Myra nodded. "I'm sorry this news upset you. Are you okay?" "Sort of," I replied. "There will always be a shadow from those days, but I focus on the good now. I'm grateful for you, the woman who saved my life." Myra looked at me seriously. "I love you, Sam." "I love you too, Myra," I replied. We fell asleep, and while life wasn't perfect, we had more good days than bad. There were still fights, nightmares, and challenges, but I knew I had the unconditional love of a woman who made everything possible, friends who accepted me, and a family that supported me through life's storms.